We're continuing through just this chapter in faith. It's called the Hall of Faith. But this particular message is called Called Out of Nimrod Country. And you'll understand that when we get a map coming up halfway through the message. And we start today with the Old Testament Saint Abraham being visited by the vision of Jesus in his heavenly glory. And people just, when we're at Bible studies at home, I get people to read even part of a sentence and say, what does that mean? Because people are so used to just reading the words and then going on to the next one and to the next one and to the next one, and they don't stop and smell the roses. And so, listen, I've had nearly a fatal heart attack. I think if the God of glory appeared to me, I think I'd have another one, wouldn't you? If he was up there, we tend to minimize these things that are in the Bible, but he was visited by the vision of Jesus in his heavenly glory, and to an Assyrian Sumerian pagan. And I'll go into why some other people don't understand that, and calling him out of this land. And we refer momentarily to visit our progress through the Hebrews chapter 11 very quickly. By faith, this is by faith, by faith, by faith. Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained witness that he was righteous. And so he was a believer in God. You can't be righteous unless you believe in God. And so he must have had this some kind of interaction when he was born and grown up and things like that. There's so many in the short narratives that we get in the Bible that there is much more in it. And we refer this to also when Paul, on his way to Damascus, was knocked off the donkey, blinded, taken into Damascus, and on Straight Street he received his sight back. And immediately after he got his sight back, he actually went around the synagogues in Damascus preaching Jesus. And every time Paul walked into a synagogue, they all had massive fright. He's here to arrest us, he's here to arrest us. No, he's not. He's born again, he's righteous, he's in God's family now. And so Jesus took him out into Sabbatean Arabia for a significant period of time. And some people make it 3 years. It's not 3 years. It was 3 years from when he left Jerusalem to go to Damascus, and it was 3 years later that he got back to Jerusalem to speak to the elders in the church in Jerusalem. And so by faith, Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice, which was a perfect, spotless lamb, the first lamb out of the ew's womb. And if you read then in Exodus chapter 12, you'll read all about the story of the Passover lamb. And it had to be absolutely spotless. There couldn't be anything wrong with it. That's why Jesus had to be both God and both man. God because he was perfect, and man because he had to die. And so he did that. And what did Cain bring God? Vegetables, which is not particularly honouring to God because it's the works of his hands, whereas Abel brought the life of a perfect lamb to be sacrificed. And do you know why that is? Is because without the sacrifice of sinless, innocent blood, you cannot approach God. And that's what Jim was alluding to in his homily this morning. And by faith, verse 5, Enoch was taken away so that he did not see death and was not found because God had taken him. And I had a long message from that. And verse 7, by faith, Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen, moved with godly fear. What's a deluge? What's a flood? He didn't know, and no one else knew at that time. And he was moved with godly fear because Jesus came and spoke to him and prepared an ark for the saving of his household, by which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is according to faith. And Jesus is preparing an ark for us now. Do you understand? So that we will not go through the judgment that's coming upon this world. Just like Noah built an ark for his family so they could repopulate the earth, Jesus is already preparing an ark for us right now, and it's called the rapture. And the ark of Noah saved 8 people through the judgment of humanity. The rapture saves you and I from the judgment of humanity, which is as rotten today as it was in the days of Noah. I alluded to the opening prayer about what Amir is sending the photos from Assyria, and I just can't believe it. I simply cannot conceive how people can just do that and stand around and take photos and glory and all the rest of it. It's just beyond my ken. If you're Scottish, you'll know what ken is. And verse 8, by faith now, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. How many of you have had family members and friends and workmates that you've been witnessing to, and they come to a place where you think they're just about ready to accept the gospel, right? Just about. And then they sink back and they say, no, I don't want to give up the life that I've got because I don't know what the life you're offering me is like. And this is where faith comes in, because Noah didn't know what was going to come. Now Abraham doesn't know what he's going to suffer when he goes out, and which he to this place which he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going, and by faith he dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob. One of my favourite chapters in Genesis 18, when it says that Abraham was sitting in the door of his tent. And I don't think it's one of the ones that you can get some BCF. They were sort of like a yurt, a Mongolian yurt, a bit more substantial, but still a tent. And so that's when Abraham was sitting in the door of his tent, and Jesus and 2 angels looking like human beings came up, and they did a bit of a conference about what to do with Sodom. And so the dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. God spoke to Isaac about the land, and so did Jacob. And this next passage is far more informational by what the author of Hebrews has done. It's just that little verse. And so I've gone back to Acts chapter 6, verse 5. And this is all about the deacon Stephen. And this is when the disciples had decided to concentrate on studying the word and preaching the word. And then they chose 7 deacons to do the looking after the congregation. And this is what happened. And the saying pleased the whole multitude that the apostles will stick to the scripture, and the deacons would help out with everything else. And they chose Stephen, a man full of faith and the Holy Spirit, and Philip, that's the one that got the Ethiopian eunuch saved down in Gaza, and he was also bringing the Samaritans to faith. And Prochorus, Nicanor, Timon, and Parmenas. And look at the last one, Nicholas, a proselyte from Antioch, which means he was a Gentile that came into the Jewish faith. And, no one is without the grace of God. And so one of the deacons was actually a Gentile, and that is a major step forward for these people at this time. And the disciples chose the deacons to serve the congregants while they studied. Now, I go further to verse 8. And Stephen, full of faith and power, did great wonders and signs amongst the people. And what he did, he probably would have done healings, he may have even done casting out demons or whatever. It doesn't say. But it actually ignited another messianic investigation by the Sanhedrin. And it was so powerful that they got, just like Jesus, they got false liars in the trials of Jesus, the 7 trials, that men would tell them lies about Jesus, and now they're in the same instance, they're telling lies about Stephen because of his wonders and signs. And at the end of the day, Satan always tries to crush evidence of God's grace and mercy to those who are in need, whether it was healing people or bringing people to belief in Jesus Christ, whatever. And there's always the other side that comes along and tries to crush what God is doing. But God always eventually has the victory. And in Acts, I go forward to 7-5. And he said, this is when they interrogated him. This is the interrogation when they asked Jesus and both John the Baptist. And they're asking him now, are you one of his followers? And he said, brethren and fathers, all very formal and honouring these people who were trying to put him in jail or even worse. And we know what happened. They killed him, basically. Brethren and fathers, listen. And by the way, the Apostle Paul, who wasn't the Apostle Paul at this moment, he was Rabbi Shaul of Tarsus. And he was watching this and listening to this. And the God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in what? Mesopotamia. What's the river that runs through Washington, D.C.? The one that George Washington crossed on a horse. You haven't got your microphone. Thank you. The Potomac. Do you know? Have a look at that. The second part of that country there. Potamia. Meso in between. What would it be? The rivers. In between the rivers. So you've got the Euphrates and you've got the Tigris, and this is where he was living, in Mesopotamia, in between the rivers, before he dwelt in Haran, and said to him, get out of your country, another order, and from your relatives, and come to a land that I will show you. Then he came out of the land of Chaldeans. This is Abraham. This is Deacon Stephen giving the Sanhedrin a history that they didn't want to hear about. Then he came out of the land of the Chaldeans and dwelt in Haran. And from there, when his father was dead, this is Terah, he moved him to this land in which you now dwell. In verse 5, and God gave him no inheritance in it, not even enough to set his foot on. But even when Abraham had no child, he promised to give it to him for a possession and to his descendants after him. And that's why when Jim alluded to the Genesis 22, Abraham, by this time, he had so much faith that he took his son up Mount Moriah and he bound him and he put him on the sticks on the altar. And I don't know how he could do this. I know it's in his faith, but I've got a beautiful son and I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't have that knife ready to be plunged into his heart. But he had so much faith because the promise of his descendants to come after him. So if he was going to have children through the son of promise, which is Isaac, not Ishmael, he knew that God had to resurrect Isaac pretty quick and carry on and give him children. And now, of all of the maps that I could source, this one, while sparse, has the issue I wanted to emphasize, just how important and difficult this was for Abraham when he was told to get out of the land of the Chaldees. And he says, the issue is that Abraham was not a Jew by birth. And you try and tell Jewish people that. They think you're a nut job, all right? Abraham was not a Jew by birth. He was an Assyrian Sumerian pagan, right? And when I was teaching the elderly Jewish people at Morris Zephyr years ago, I used to tease them by asking them, who was the first Jew? And they would answer, Moses. No, wrong. King David. No, wrong. And they'd say, we know who you want us to say. You want us to say Jesus was the first Jew. And I said, no, sorry, that's 2,000 years late, no good to that. So I had to tell them that Abraham was the first. And some of them would say, oh, of course. And the others would say, was he? And so, they get the Torah every year, 5 books of the Torah. But sometimes, because it just doesn't sit in their spirit, you know what I mean? It just does not sit with them. What is the reality? And the next question I asked them was, Abraham Jewish? And they said, of course he was. And I had to shatter their illusion. I had to say, no, he wasn't. He was an Assyrian Sumerian pagan whose dad made silver idols for pagan worship. And it produced a lot of wealth for the family, which allowed them then, as a group, to travel north to Haran. And that distance was 645 miles. That's 1,038 kilometres from Ur in the Chaldees up to Haran. And we simply cannot imagine what that means in terms that we could understand. So I got this map to give you some understanding. Just a few words in Scripture describing a movement from Ur of Chaldee. And we get the map. Did we get? Yes! I went through map after map after map after map trying to find something really interesting. Now have a look at that. I'll stand right back there. There is, that's Ur of the Chaldees. All of the maps I looked at had it there. I disagree. It has to be there if it's in Mesopotamia. It has to be between the rivers. And that there isn't actually the journey track. It was up through here between the rivers, and they got to Haran, and then I'll tell you why. But I love this, I absolutely love this, Matt, because this guy knows what he's talking about. And it was Ur of Chaldea, and what is that there that I've shown you in the past? It's a ziggurat. It's not a tall tower of pizza, all right? It is a ziggurat, and this guy is spot on. That is the original Tower of Babel, and it was 2,275 BC. And so they went all the way up here to Haran. Now, that's 1,038 kilometres. Can you believe that? And even when they've rested in Haran, and I'll tell you how long they were there, supposedly by the Syriac records, it was almost as bad going from Haran back down to Bethel and to Hebron. And so you don't and I don't understand what they had to do to leave all that they had lived in. Abraham was 70 when he left Ur of the Chaldees, and Terah was 191. So to carry him on some kind of stretcher or a chair or whatever, that must have been absolutely horrifying. So 138 kilometres is the first stage. And I love that one, but I've got you another one. It was so difficult to get a map for this one. The next map, the green one, guys. Can you see Perth? Can you see Perth? Yeah. Then Geraldton, then Overlander, then Carnarvon, and that little red dot there is Minalea Roadhouse. How many's been up there? Yeah. That's 1,024. That's the nearest thing I could get to 1,038. Who wants to set off tomorrow and walk to Minalea? I don't think so. Do you know what I mean? And that gives us a perspective of what Abram had to do to obey God and take his whole family all the way up there. Thanks, guys. So anywhere between 1 to 3 months if you're just walking by yourself. How long, we don't know, because Terah was very old and they would probably have to have carried him, and they made it to Haran when Terah was 191 years old. And they waited at Haran till Terah died at the age of 205. And that's not a bad span. But what's really interesting is that some well-known commentators, so he was there at 191 and 205, so some commentators have posited that Abraham had a lapse of faith, as the ancient Syriac records have Abraham waiting there for 14 years. And I think that is just dreadful. You know, this is one of these things that people say, but they have absolutely no biblical backup for that fact or that statement. Do you understand? There's no verse anywhere else I've found right through the Bible, and that I'm not even going to lift that thing up, it falls apart. There is no reason to do that. The logical reason is that Terah was so old and so infirm that to take him across, wading across the Euphrates, they may have lost him downstream or whatever. It's just ridiculous to say that Abram had a lapse of faith. It would have been recorded somewhere later on in Genesis. And they went to the land that God, Jesus, was sending him, and that involved the crossing of the Euphrates River, which at this point was able to be waded through, because the Euphrates goes through some gorges, which is deep and running fast. But here at Haran, it was wide and shallow enough for people to walk across. But that was impossible to carry Terah on a bed across the river. And the land of Canaan, not only that, but the land of Canaan at that time had a fierce reputation as a violent place to venture into. And those who waded through the Euphrates, north to south, were called, wait for it, my wife's just said it, Hebrews. The word Hebrew means he who crosses the river. And very few people wanted to. And it was an unusual description of those who did. And I always found that very, very interesting. Because Hebrews 11 is the chapter of faith, let's look at 4 aspects of Abraham's faith in leaving Ur at the age of 70, having had the God of glory, as Stephen said, appeared to him in Ur of the Chaldees, and pack his rucksack. And I think that I, even as an unsaved but searching soul, if I had been given the amazing gift of grace by God, and with him in the sky telling me to do certain things, I think I would have also agreed without any hesitation if I'd got over my heart attack, because I can't imagine seeing him up there in his glory. There, and you know, we openly declare the glory of God, but in Psalm 19 verse 1, it's my favourite one. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament, the earth, shows his handiwork. And you know what the reality is, and I've told you before, and I've seen some of you nod, that some of you have been out in the desert in Western Australia or South Australia, doesn't matter, on a moonless night, and you look up at the Milky Way and it's staggeringly beautiful, absolutely staggeringly beautiful. And even as I was nearly saved, that was a few months later, but I even looked at that because I'd been to church for years as a kid and a teenager. And I remembered this verse immediately. The heavens declare the glory of God. I don't know how many of you who haven't been out to the desert on a moonless night, you should treat yourself. It's an absolutely fabulous experience. And so there are 4 aspects to the just-born faith of Abraham. And this is what I was measuring my faith while putting all of these messages together. That he obeyed the call of God, of the God of glory, to tell him to leave his home and go to a foreign land. That is in verse 8. And we've already gone through that. 2, his unshakable hope in one day seeing the heavenly city, the eternal city in the heavens and the new earth, the new heavens and the new earth. And so in Jesus appearing to Abraham, he must have told him all of these things, just as well he told so much to Paul in Sabbatean Arabia. And he wrote those all out in his 14 epistles in the New Testament. And so he had a hope to one day in his glorious resurrection, he wanted to see the heavenly New Jerusalem, which we get to see in Revelation 21 and 22, the eternal city in the new heavens. And by faith, this is what verse 9 says, he dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob. And that faith in God, that vision that he had of Jesus is still keeping him there. And the heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city of the foundations, that has the foundations, whose builder and maker is God. And that is so true. And the third aspect of his faith was trusting God for him to have an heir through Sarah, who was barren. And I'll go through 11 and 12. By faith, Sarah herself also received strength at 90 to conceive seed. Ladies, any takers giving birth at 90? I don't think so, but anyway. And she conceived Isaac. And she bore a child when she was past the age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, he was 100. Men, you up to it? No, I don't hear a rousing no. Maybe you would want to, but no, that's not right. So anyway, he was 100 years old, and this son was born out of him, as many as the stars of the sky in multitude, innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. And I often wonder about that phrase, and I'm still working through it. And the fourth aspect of his faith was the offering of the heir as a sacrifice. He was told that he was going to have to do that when he did have a son through Sarah. And, you know, it's amazing. If you go down our passageway in the house, an old Jewish man, when he was very close to death, I was looking after him at the time for several years, and he said, have a look at all the paintings on the wall. Pick one. And I said, I want that one. And he said, take it, right. And it's a beautiful painting, and I bet most of you, when you come to the Bible study, you just walk right past it. It's the offering of Isaac on Mount Moriah. And it's called, Genesis 22 is called the Akedah. And the Hebrew of Akedah is the binding. That's all it is, just the binding. And so Abram had to bound Isaac as a sacrifice and put him on the twigs. Also wood on that mountain. It's just amazing. The Bible is inexhaustible. Ephesia, Jim said, look anywhere in the Bible and it bleeds. It does. And if it doesn't, you should, because he did that for us. In verse 17, by faith Abraham, when he was, the offering of the year, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son. So there he was on the altar, on the sticks, all bound up. And he remembered of whom it was said, in Isaac your seed shall be called. And Abraham concluded that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. Now, he's gone and he's obeyed. He's left Mesopotamia in between the two rivers, in which he grew up, and the society within which he lived, to be given such grace and mercy by God, because if you were looking for an Abraham, God found him in one of the most wicked places on the planet at that time. That's why that ziggurat was there at Ur of the Chaldees. And I will repeat what I said last week, that after the flood, wickedness rose up as if it was never abated by the flood. I mean, there was about 1,500 years in the Genesis 6 area, and then going up to the preparing of the ark. But you would think that the devastation of the flood, and then only 8 people getting back onto dry land at Mount Ararat. In fact, that was on that map there. It was a very good map, actually. And out of the 3 men, humanity actually flourished in the 3 generations from on. And Ham was the one that had a son. One of the sons was called Cush. So that's from Ham down to Cush. That's a generation. And Cush had a son, and guess who his name is? Nimrod. So it only took 3 generations after the flood to get back to Genesis 6, to wickedness. It was unbelievable, unbelievable. If we had a stop to the history of this earth right now, and he took us away but brought us back again to repopulate the earth and whatever he's going to do, it would take that. There's something in a human being is drawn to the dark side. And if you aren't born again and you don't have the Holy Spirit in you and you are not declared righteous by God, there is such a pull to the dark side. You know, in Matthew chapter 7, when Jesus is teaching the disciples, he says in 13 and 14, he said, walk the narrow way and go through the narrow gate, because he is the narrow gate. You only get to heaven by going through the narrow gate. Who's the narrow gate? Yes. And so he said, wide is the gate that leads to destruction, and he says, and many travel it. But those who find the narrow gate are few. That's from the words of Jesus. Few get saved and many don't. Why? Because they reject Jesus. It's not Jesus' fault. They, either there's really wicked people and they don't want a bar of Jesus, or they've heard about him and they've sort of walked towards him, and then they think, no, I'm not going to give up everything I've got now. He's not worth it, and they go back again. The few and the many. And there are several verses in the New Testament that back up what Jesus said. And it's just, look, when you're born again, I simply cannot understand why reprobate people will not turn to the God of glory. And I don't know whether even a heavenly visitation from Jesus would do it, because I just can't believe as a believer that you would reject everything that God has got waiting for us when we get up there. It's like when Jim said we get into Revelation chapter 4, we're seated on thrones around the throne, and then Jesus takes the scroll, and then he flicks the first seal, and it's the rider on the white horse who signs a covenant with Israel on behalf of the whole world, and then the tribulation starts. And everyone doesn't understand there's two halves. The Jews are protected in the first half, but the church is murdered in the first half. And you've got to read Revelation 17, because the harlot of Babylon is drenched with the blood of the saints. Well, where does that come from? Killing Christians in the first 3.5 years. But afterwards, they start killing the Jewish people. And I think it's Zechariah 13, verses 8 and 9, that 2/3 will perish and 1/3 will make it through. Can you believe that? That's his own people. That's his own people who have rejected him. And sadly, if you look at genuine born-again believing Gentiles within the Gentile world on this planet now, I don't know if you could even announce a fraction of what we are. There's a lot of people who go to church who aren't Christians, I'll tell you right now. And so Zechariah gives me a hint that I lived this because I did a study on it time and time again, because it was so good. Why was this place so wicked, and yet God chose him to take him from there, out of there, to be the progenitor of the Israeli nation? And it's one of my favourite passages. It's Zechariah 5 verses 5 to 11. And we've started at 5 because the first 4 verses, you should read this, it's only 11 verses. But the first 4 verses is about a scroll written on the front side and the back side, which is the deed of a property. And it's the way God treats and deals with the people who have rejected his son. And it's really, it'll wake you up. It will really wake you up. Why? Not you, but your family, friends and workmates who just will not accept Jesus. And that's their fate in those first 4 verses. But I'm not going to do that now. But this is one of my favourite ones, from 5 through to 11. Then the angel who was talking to me about the scroll previously came out and said to me, "Lift your eyes now and see what this is that goes forth." And so Zechariah says to the angel, so I asked, "What is it?" And he said, "It is a basket that is going forth from here to somewhere. And he also said, the angel also said, this is their resemblance throughout the earth. So it starts in a particular place and it spreads everywhere throughout the earth. And in verse 7, here is the lead disc lifted up. And so Zechariah in this vision sees the lead disc on this basket. It's an ephah, but it really is a basket. A basket is just a measure, and you can't define it because all different countries had different weights in the ephah. But it's a basket that is going forth. And he, the angel, also said, this is their resemblance throughout the earth. Here is a lead disc lifted up, and this is a woman sitting inside the basket. Verse 8. And by the way, I've got nothing absolutely against women. I'm not extolling this woman who's in the basket. I was born from one. I married one. I, through her, got one. And through my son, I got a grand one. And they're all as tough as nuts. No, she's gorgeous, but... and listen, my auntie was a... I just shook in her presence. And I came back very well behaved when I got back from a stay with her. And then my sister, my elderly sister, oh my giddy aunt, she could flea the flesh off my body if I did something wrong. And then my daughter does the same thing. This is the only one I ever get any genuine, real love with, you know. And even then, that can go like the heat waves in the... But this is, and don't blame me, this is the scripture. And there is a woman inside the basket. And the angel said to Zechariah, this is wickedness. Now see the capital W, this is evil. And it's a metaphor for wickedness. Can I tell you something without risking suicide? In my 30 years of pastoring, I have always come to the conclusion that women are spiritually stronger, mostly, than men. We're very logical, they're very spiritual. And you know, that's the truth. I've found that so long. If you want to go to a prayer meeting in a church, guess who is the majority there? Women. Do you know what I mean? It's getting better now with men, but I still think that women are still spiritually stronger, averaged over men. And so this is wickedness, and he, the angel, thrust her down into the basket and threw the lead cover over its mouth. And verse 9, then I raised my eyes and looked, and there were two women, don't blame me, it's in the scripture, coming with wind in their wings, for they had wings like the wings of a stork. Now, in Jewish theology, a stork is an unclean bird. Do you understand? So this is even worse than just the woman called wickedness in the ephah. But look what they do. And they lifted up the basket between earth and heaven. So I said to the angel who talked with me, where are they carrying the basket? And he said to me, to build a house for it, that is wickedness, to build a house for wickedness, where? In the land of Shinar. In the land of Shinar. And when it is ready, the basket will be set there on its base. And in Babylon, Babylon was slightly further up the Tigris River, but it's still in that Chaldean area. But because of Nimrod and what he set up as a religion, if I can say it like that, the wickedness in him building those ziggurats, I've told you it was nothing to do climbing up into the heavens trying to meet God face to face. That's absurd because you can only go 8,000 feet off the surface of the earth and you've got no oxygen. And as Jim corrected me last week, Mount Everest is 29,000. You know, what's $5,000 between $2,000? You know, give me a break. But anyway, it's in the land of Shinar. And do you know that in the First Gulf War, prior to that, Hussein had already rebuilt Babylon to the price of several $billion. So it's just waiting there. And you know, when all of the wars happen around that area, nothing ever happens to Babylon. Do you think about that? Nothing ever happens to Babylon. Everyone else gets bombed and burnt and all the rest of it, but Babylon's still there. And John Loeffler, who was a very close friend of Chuck Missler, worked out that the UN would most likely be moved from New York back to Babylon. And Chuck told me that 20 years ago. And I said, no, well, can't really understand that. Well, look at it now. The UN and Trump don't get on. And I don't know if the relationship will get so bad that the UN says, no, we're not staying here in Trump land. We'll go to Babylon land. And I think it's quite feasible, because if you do a very tight study of Revelation 17 and 18, it is the centre of the world at the end of this age. And so this is what Zechariah saw. And he saw the precursor of Babylon being the centre of the Antichrist's kingdom in this time. And I think it's absolutely fascinating. And we're living in that time. We're seeing that time. I actually don't want to open up my phone now, because the first thing you get is about 40 Amir things. And I take all of his information that's going on there, but I can't take the photos. I just leave them, you know, those spotty things where you don't see what's going on behind them. I just can't do it. It's just so wicked. So this is what happened. This is why I'm amazed that God chose Abraham from this land and took him all the way up to Haran. His dad died, and then he went down to Bethel for a start. And then he was the progenitor through Isaac and Jacob. Isaac had Esau and Jacob, and then Jacob had the 12 patriarchs. And out of that came the Jewish nation. And so that was all in God's plan. It was absolutely amazing. So this is the faith of Abraham. And you could go on for weeks, but that's enough. So Father, we just thank you for giving us this deeper insight as to your grace and your mercy. This is not just a historical fact, Father. You, in your grace and mercy, took a person out of one of the most wicked places on earth, in the plain of Shinar, and you brought him out. You brought him out. And that's what you do when you save us, Lord. You bring us out of this world, and we're citizens of heaven. So, Father, I do thank you for this understanding. I thank you that you've given us eyes to see and ears to hear why this world is like it is at the moment. And, Father, I do pray that you just lean to your Son right now, if I may be so bold, and say to him, go get your bride. And all God's people said.